In 1918, in September 1918, American troops were being deployed for the first time in large numbers. And there was only one general who was seen to be, Allied general in the British order of battle, who was seen to be a suitable candidate to command American troops in the field. Americans did not like other generals, understandably, commanding them there. And that man was John Monash. John Monash was of German Jewish family, born in Australia. His first language was German. He was an engineer. He was a linguist. He was a part-time soldier in 1914. He turns out to have been perhaps the most brilliant commander of men in the field in 1918. It could be plausibly argued that he was actually the best soldier on any side in the First World War. And one of his primary objectives was to ensure that as few of his men were killed as possible. He was a deeply humanitarian, passionate man. He wanted Allied victory, but he wanted his men to return home to make babies with their wives. And he did return home, and his wife died of cancer. And from that blow, he never recovered. But he gave himself entirely to the Allied cause, and gave himself to the principles he felt were right and proper, and that is the preservation of life whenever necessary and whenever possible. In 1918, Renault, the French car manufacturer that is no longer making cars, began to make tanks. And one of the most important managers, senior managers in Renault, was descendant of a Polish family who had moved to Holland, Polish Jews, and they were fruit merchants. And in Holland they decided to give themselves a Dutch name. And that Dutch name was Limonman, because it was a nice way of selling, I'm a fruit man and I'm selling lemons. Actually, lime is what it means in Dutch. But the son of that family moved to France, and he changed his name to another citric fruit, citron. And then he added the E, the diaeresis, the double dots, to become Citroën. And he was the powerhouse in the Renault factories of 1918. And in the 1920s, he set up for himself. And he decided that cars were wrong. Big chassis, a lot of weight, a lot of petrol, a lot of noise, a lot of discomfort. And he came up with a car that was low centre of gravity, independent suspension, and front-wheel drive. No one had done this before. This was a completely new version of the car. But it was too ambitious. And Citroën motor car, not merely did it go bust and was bought up by Michelin, he died of stress-related cancer. But that car, that Jewish-designed car, was to be the inspiration for most of the cars of the world from the 1960s onwards. Most small cars are built on the lines prescribed by André Citroën. While he was struggling to create a new form of car in France, another Jew, Josef Ganz, in Germany, was arguing exactly the same thing. Cars were too big, too noisy. He came up with a small car to be made by the small works called Standard Fahrzeugfabrik. It was called the Maikäfer in German. I hope my German accent isn't too incomprehensible, which means May Beetle or cockchafer. In the company, it was known as the People's Car, or Volkswagen. Hitler came to power January the 30th, 1933. On February the 15th, Berlin Motor Show opened, and this Jewish-designed Volkswagen Beetle was on display. Very soon after that, Ganz was arrested, beaten, and he fled. But the VW Beetle that he designed rear engine. He actually had a two-stroke engine in the back. When Ferdinand Porsche got the car, he installed an air-cooled engine. So that was the difference. But you can see, if you can look it up on the internet, you can see that the car is the same. This was the car that transformed the German economy when they had finished the final solution. Israel got nothing from this, no Jew did. It transformed Germany. And it's a Jewish design. I know the ambassador and I have a common interest in aeroplanes. I want to go back again to 1913 to an aeronautical college in Toulouse, just founded. And there are two Jewish students there. One of them was Mikhail Gurevich, he was Russian, and the other was Marcel Bloch, who was French. And they go their two ways with the coming of war. And Mikhail returns to Russia, survives the revolution, never joins the Communist Party, which is really interesting, unlike other senior people within the new Soviet regime. But he was interested in making planes, and he met a man of like mind called Mikhail, Artem Mikhail, who was Armenian. Now, they had to come up with a name to combine the two names. They could have been Gum. But Gum is the name of a department store in Moscow. That would never do. You can't have an aeroplane, a fighter plane named after a department store. Fighter plane called Brown Thomas or Brown Comet or Tesco would be ridiculous. So they put Mikhail first, M-I, and they put the G at the end. So Mig was born. Mig is half Jewish. That was the greatest manufacture of jet aircraft in the history of the world. No one has made as many jet fighters as did the MiG. And using the extraordinarily primitive technology available in Russia, what the design bureau did was extraordinary. MiG-15, MiG-17, MiG-19, MiG-21. MiG-21, over 20,000 models, versions of the MiG-21 were made. I suppose Mikhail Gurevich didn't mind the MiG so much because they also, MiG, spelt out the initials of his name, MiG. And he was such a modest man. In addition to braving Stalin's wrath by never joining the Communist Party, when Mikhail died, he allowed the Joint Bureau to be called, just named after him, Mikhail. And the name of the company today is Mikhail. And Mikhail Josefovich Gurevich is forgotten. As too is Marcel Bloch, sort of forgotten. I told you about the tanks that were being made by Renault in 1918. The French don't use foreign words, generally speaking, and they called it Charles Dassault, chariot of assault. I tell you that now. Marcel Bloch was an aircraft designer in the 1930s, and when the Germans came in 1940, he was Jewish, but he was told he would be allowed to remain alive and practice and do whatever he wanted and be paid very much, very well, if he threw in his lot with the Nazis, and he said, no, I won't. First of all, he was arrested by the Vichy French, who handed him over to the Germans, who then persuaded him, and didn't persuade him, they tried to persuade him to work for them, and he didn't. So he goes to Buchenwald. And logically, he should not have survived Buchenwald. It was the bureaucratic oversight that led him not being killed. But when he emerged from Buchenwald, Marcel Bloch decided he was never going to be a Jew on the run again. He named himself after the Shah Dassault, and that's how the Dassault company came into existence. The Dassault Mystère and the Dassault Mirage, that were the backbone of Israel's defences through the 1950s and 1960s, were designed by a Jewish company. Bizarrely, later in his life, he became a Catholic. But it is as a Jew that he shaped not merely the future of the French Air Force with a variety of brilliant designs, but also ensure the survival of Israel through the 1950s and 1960s. If I were to ask you now about penicillin and where it came from, I'd be confident that 95% of you would tell me Alexander Fleming was responsible for it. It's not true. Just not true. That vital date, January the 30th, 1933, is a pivotal moment in the history of antibiotics because a young Jewish student called Ernst Schoen next day decided to leave Germany. And he went to Britain, to England, went to a number of institutions where his brilliance was instantly recognized. Now, Fleming had identified the fact that a certain fungus will produce a germicidal effect that will protect it from attack. He got no further than that. He's a very modest man, Fleming. He always described his celebrity as the Fleming myth. He had nothing whatever to do with making the drug penicillin. That was Ernst Boris Schoen, the Jewish refugee. Now, he was working with Howard Florey, who was Australian. He's working under the supervision of Howard Florey. Howard Florey and he and Fleming all got the Nobel Prize. But there's no denying that there would have been no Nobel Prize, and no antibiotics without Ernst Schoen. Putting all other hyperbole aside, is it possible that there is a greater man in the history of civilization than this man, who has enabled millions to live? Millions and millions and millions, and the simple bacteria which once upon a time would have spelt death for us all if invading our systems, now can be conquered. Not just by Schoen's contribution. There was another major contribution from a young student in the United States of America who, following the inspiration, and is the inspiration provided by Schoen, began to look for a stronger antibiotic. The term antibiotic was invented by Selman Waxman of Rutgers University. He obviously is Jewish. But Albert Israel Schatz found streptomycin. And streptomycin has virtually abolished from the face of the earth TB and cholera and typhoid and bubonic plague. And without him, without these three Jews, who knows how antibiotics would be brought into the service of mankind and womankind. There are questions to which there are no simple answers. When I last counted a couple of weeks ago, 892 Nobel Prizes had been awarded. 201 of them, 22.5%, went to Jews. That's 0.2% of the population getting 22.5% of the Nobel Prizes. And the Nobel Prizes are not awarded in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, as you know. They're awarded in Oslo and Stockholm. There could not be a more impartial assessment of value. And I have to tell you, I've looked into this quite carefully, and I'm quite convinced that the numbers of Jews are underrepresented in the Nobel lists. That a great many Jews are not getting Nobel Prizes simply because they are Jewish, and it appeared to be too ludicrous for yet more Jews to be awarded the thing. Look at New York City. New York City has won 40 Nobel Prizes, 37 of them were to Jews. There is something called the Keene-Divinsky measurement system. I have no idea how it works. But it assesses retrospectively the quality of Grand Masters. I don't know how you can do this, but the Keene-Divinsky system purports to do this. of the 64 finest chess players in history, 29 of them have been Jewish. Now, I don't want to talk to you about famous Jews like Einstein and Freud and Adler and Popper and Isaiah Berlin. I mean, these people are well known. What I wanted to talk to you was about the less visible side, less known, less acknowledged side of Jewishness. And you get a very good sense of what Jews have done for the world from the Oxford Dictionary of Biography, which does list ethnic background, ethnic/religious background, and how Jews become eminent. The Oxford Dictionary has 51,103 names in it. 1,344 of those are Jews. And that's 2.5% of the population, even though Jews comprise just 0.3% of the population of the United Kingdom and Ireland. The dictionary covers Ireland too. The breakdown is really illustrative of what Jews do and how they become celebrated. Business and finance, it is 13%. Scholars, teachers, musicians and writers, 50%. For science and technology and medicine, 17%. So within those categories, business and finance comes third. 14 Jews have gone into space, or 2.6% of the total of 535. And we know 0.2% of the world's population is Jewish. So it's 13 times more Jews have gone into space than their numbers merit. The first Jew into space is a Russian Jew, Soviet Jew, Boris Volyanov, Soyuz 5 in 1969. He was taking 2 crewmen up to the Earth orbiting vehicle and was coming back to space to ground because there wasn't enough space for him. So he's making the journey to ground by himself. He had an equipment module attached to his vehicle which he attempted to detach by small explosive charges, but the charges didn't work and he was returning to Earth orbit. Departing from Earth orbit to go to ground. Not merely was the equipment module not detached, it prevented the heat shield being shifted into front of his own vehicle. Meanwhile, he was strapped pointing the wrong way, so that instead of being sitting going down that way, he was facing towards the certain doom. An aluminium door was between him and the Earth's atmosphere. When he finally collided with the Earth's atmosphere, and aluminium, of course, will instantly turn into poisonous gas the moment the friction starts. Except a miracle intervened. The impact of the Earth's atmosphere began to make his vehicle shudder. That caused the equipment module to separate, and the heat shield was banged into place. As he entered the Earth's atmosphere, the thing nearly exploded, but he came through. He fired the retro rockets to slow it down, but the retro rockets were damaged. They didn't fire. So then he unleashed his parachutes, and the parachutes got entangled. So he plummeted onto the ground at 5 to 10 times the speed that where safety was possible. He should have been killed. He lost all his teeth on impact. He was not where he should have landed, in the desert in Kazakhstan where the reception committee was. No, he was in the Urals. The temperature was minus 38 degrees. No one knew where he was. So he had to get out of the shattered space vehicle and walk through minus 38 degrees, looking for someone to help him. And he comes to a hut, and he knocks on the door. And history doesn't relate what the conversation there consisted of. The peasant says, "You were doing what?" Okay. That's enough of space, isn't it? You think for this man, 7 years later, he's in space again. Coming down with the second man, they have to leave the orbit early because the second man is unwell. The same thing happens. He can't get out of space orbit when he wants to, and he moves around the world so that he can't receive transmission from Earth base. When he returns, he gets instructions again from the Earth base, and he lands again with comparable drama. He was called a hero of the Soviet Union twice over. The term Soviet Union doesn't mean anything. The term hero applies forever. This man's a real hero. Judith Resnick was from Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Akron, Ohio. Her father was an eye specialist. She had done 200 hours in the Apollo program. A great engineer, a linguist, concert pianist, up to pianist to concert level, and a mathematician. Those of you who are old enough will remember the Challenger takeoff in 1986 when Judith was one of the 11 astronauts who were killed. Some of you in this room will also be aware of Ilan Ramon. His family had survived the Holocaust. He was a secular Jew until he became the first Israeli in space. But then decided to go more orthodox. And he was the first man, first passenger, first person in space ever to consume kosher food. He took up artifacts from the Holocaust while he circuited the Earth, and he kept a diary. One of the artifacts he kept was the diary of a boy who died in Auschwitz, a 17-year-old boy, and somehow or other, by miraculous means, that diary had survived. And 15 years ago, when Columbia STS-107 was returning to Earth, it detonated on impact with the Earth's atmosphere. And in that hypersonic inferno, in which as much energy was released as would have been released by a small nuclear device, all of the crew vanished. That diary was travelling at 17 times the speed of sound, passed through an inferno the like of which we cannot imagine, and made it to the Texas desert where it was found months later. There is barely a more astonishing parable for the Jewish experience than that. It could not have been possible, but it was. Now, he is a hero in Israel, and understandably he had taken part in 2 major operations to protect the state of Israel, including a bombing operation against the Iraqi nuclear facility in 1980. And of course the state of Israel was beside itself with excitement at the idea that this son of Israel should have been in space. His wife was named Rona. They had a son, Asaf, who was killed in an F-16 training accident sometime later. I'm not going to end there. I'm going to end at the beginning. I'm going to end where the Jews always begin. I'm going to quote from the great Jewish lyricist, the great woman lyricist, Dorothy Fields. She was the daughter of Moses Schoenfeld. And she wrote an imperishable tune that should be a guide and a mentor to us all, whoever we are and wherever we come from, whatever our background, whatever our aspirations. It's a very simple tune, by Jerome Kern. It's what Jews have always done throughout the ages, after the Black Hundreds have visited them, and after the black shirts of the SS have visited them. And those who have survived have done this. Pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and start all over again. Thank you.